Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the LSE. Whatever time zone you're in, you are very welcome, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. We can't welcome you to the LSE without making reference to the fact that we're welcoming you to a digital rather than an atomic London School of Economics and Political Science. And that has only one main virtue, which is it allows people from much further afield to join us in our conversations. So you're very welcome to this LSE Marshall Institute public lecture. In a minute, you'll hear from Connson, Locke and Christian Busch. Start to think about the wonderful questions you're going to ask Christian and think about posing those through the Q&A function or through Facebook. For those of you who don't know already, the Marshall Institute is a small institute at the heart of the LSE, committed to understanding more about private action for public benefit. And also the place to have just launched a new executive MSc in social business and entrepreneurship, which we describe as the antidote to the MBA. So as you listen to Christian, you'll start to hear a little bit about why that might be. Christian's book, which I spent the day reading. Today is publication day, by the way. And many decades ago, I was a publisher, so I'm not going to pass up the opportunity to recommend that over my left shoulder you see Christian's book and that you immediately go to your preferred online retailer and order a copy. But his book ends, and I've just finished it today, with a sentence that reminds me of the Marshall Institute's purpose, the purpose of scholarship being engaged commitment to improving the state of the world. And that sentence is, once we start questioning structures, we open up a whole new world for ourselves and others. And that's a sentiment with which I heartily agree. It's my great pleasure now to introduce my friend and colleague, and indeed part of the MBA Antidote faculty, Professor Connson Locke, who's going to introduce Christian and moderate the session. Welcome to LSE, welcome Christian, welcome Connson.
Thank you, Stefan. So hi, everyone. I am really pleased to be introducing Christian. I've known Christian since I joined LSE in 2008. Yes, a long time ago. So I joined as a new assistant professor at the time, and Christian was a master's student. And the year after that, in 2009, he became a PhD student. And I have been impressed with him since then, because he has somehow managed to create serendipity in his own life from the moment I knew him. Like back then, as a PhD student, he managed to start something called the Co-Creation Lab with his supervisor, Professor Harry Barkema. And I was like, whoa, what's this? It was really interesting. It was all about nurturing entrepreneurship and social impact. Like his interests are all about entrepreneurship, social impact, and innovation. He managed to teach at the LSE for a few years after finishing the PhD, and we taught together on a summer school negotiations course. He also helped me out with some of the executive courses I was teaching. And then he managed to land a job at New York University last year, which I was really impressed with. But because we didn't want to let him go, he still got a visiting professorship at the LSE at the Marshall Institute. I mean, seriously, like what is the best outcome you could possibly think of for a PhD student? And this is it. So he has managed to create serendipity in his own life. So I think he is highly qualified to write this book. I actually asked him, because I was looking at his book, and obviously I read the book in preparation for this, but I was noticing on the back that he's got all these endorsements from really famous people. And I've just finished writing a book myself, and I know how hard it is to get these endorsements. And he's got Dan Pink, Ariana Huffington, Reid Hoffman. And I'm like, what, how did you do this? And he said, well, I went to a lot of conferences. I met a lot of people. I sent a lot of warm and cold emails. You know, it was a numbers game. And I was like, whoa, you really do practice what you preach. So I think when, you know, sometimes when you hear authors talking, you're like, well, do they really know what they're talking about? I think in this case, Christian does know what he's talking about, because he not only researches what he's written about, but he lives it in his own life. So I am very pleased to introduce to you Christian Busch.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, Connson. And likewise, it's been such a delight and pleasure to work with you, and especially also in the context of the Marshall Institute, which has been such a fertile ground for a lot of this work. And so thank you so much also, Stefan, for in a way always encouraging us to do that kind of work that questions a lot of structures and questions how things work, and that allows us to really push some boundaries, hopefully. So I'm delighted to be here today. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd love to take you on a journey of serendipity. And it's really something, as Connson mentioned, this has been on my mind for a very long time, both as a kind of life philosophy and as a kind of daily practice of how to live a life that is somehow meaningful and purpose-driven. So being the German I am, of course, I have a very structured table of content. So what I'd love to do is I'd briefly talk a little bit about context. Where does this all come from? What are the kind of, you know, what was the playing field that we've been thinking about? Then what is the art and science of serendipity? What can we learn from both research and practice? And then really a couple of practices that we can all take into our day-to-day. And then I think we'll dive deeper with Connson into some of the questions that you might all have. And I'm really looking forward to that interaction. Also, in the spirit of serendipity, I'd be extremely excited for you to reach out, being that via Twitter, LinkedIn, or other ways, to really see if there could be potential overlaps with your work as well. In terms of context, I had a experience early on in life when I was 18, a car crash that made me realize how quickly life can be over. It was that kind of situation where I would smash into a couple of parked cars, and the policeman who came to the scene, I will not forget that sentence where he said, oh, wow, he's still alive. So this idea that I was supposed to be dead. And so that kind of sentence, you know, got me into this whole question of, if it would have been over, would it all have been worth it? Did I live a life that was somehow meaningful? At that point, I had to answer all these questions with a very clear no. It wasn't that meaningful until then. And so I think it took me on this intense search for meaning. I started reading a lot of Viktor Frankl, who has this wonderful book. You know how some people have the Bible next to their bed or something else. I have my Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And he wrote a lot about how do we find meaning in crisis? How do we find meaning in the toughest of situations? And so I've been very inspired by this. And it took me on this journey of really trying to figure out what is it that I could contribute to this world that is somehow meaningful in some way or the other. And as Connson mentioned, I started out more as a kind of entrepreneur, community builder. We set up a community called Sandbox, which was all about bringing together young people, helping them make ideas happen. And what happened all the time at these dinners was people would always go like, oh my God, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence. And so it seemed like serendipity was accelerated in some form or the other. And so I got really excited about this in my own life. I saw it with myself that somehow luck seemed to happen more often if I did certain things. And then, you know, at some point I kind of felt, okay, we're building all these different things, but do we actually understand what we're trying to do here in terms of the actual impact we're having? And so I went more into academia on that route that Connson described, trying to understand how do we really develop meaningful, purpose-driven lives and businesses. And to my absolute delight, when looking at the most successful, purpose-driven, inspiring people that I researched, they all had something in common. They somehow intuitively cultivated serendipity. They somehow saw something the unexpected all the time and somehow always did something with it and turned into positive outcomes. And so what I want to talk today about is really kind of what the gist of the book is, which is to say, there are people who intuitively practice something that we can all learn from and that we can all somehow build, which is this kind of serendipity mindset that's all about turning the unexpected, turning uncertainty into positive outcomes. Now, in terms of the book itself, it's been quite a ride. It's based on kind of over a decade of own experiences and research. Has a lot of stories from around the world. So from A lot of my work has been in sub-Saharan Africa, so it's an extremely resource-constrained environment, particularly in Kenya and also parts of South Africa, to the CEO of companies here in the US or the UK, to the teacher in London. So really kind of a diversity of stories, and really trying to understand what are the patterns behind these stories. So what can we understand behind, what is a science-based framework that allows us to understand what these people have been doing differently and what we can learn from it. And so what has helped with this a lot is that the beautiful thing that I realized during the last couple of years, diving deeper into this, is that essentially all sciences say the same about serendipity. Like you can look into molecular sciences where they accelerate molecules that have unknown reactions, and by accelerating them more and more, you will have more kind of positive outcomes. You by definition don't know what it will be, but it will happen. You know, in physics, there's this idea of entropy. You have to get things in motion so that things actually happen. You have in management a lot around the question of serendipity and so on. So the beauty is that in a way, all the different sciences and social sciences are telling us or pointing us to a similar direction. And so the goal with this was really to say, how do we bring all of this together, ground it in a science-based framework, and then make it come alive through different stories and examples, and most importantly, exercises that help us build this muscle for serendipity so that we can have it in our day-to-day life as well. Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought I'd start with a couple of examples. And, you know, if you think maybe in your own life, the role of serendipity that played, you know, maybe how you met your co-founder or your love partner, or, you know, how you maybe changed jobs, whatever it is, I'm sure there's kind of these moments that were completely unexpected, but somehow it shaped your life. And you know how all of us, when we always obviously tell our CV as if we went from A to B to C, but obviously we probably all also had moments of, you know, oh, that was an unexpected running into. And I think the moments I've had with Stefan and Connson around unexpected things, where then a project comes out of it, is a whole story in itself, but it's obviously what really shapes our lives a lot of times. And as someone who comes from Germany, you know, where we're used to planning and trying to structure everything, it's been really interesting to see that once we're building this muscle, we essentially get uncertainty and ambiguity away from something that is anxiety enhancing to something that actually can become an ally. And so that's really what I want to talk about. But so, you know, imagine this kind of quintessential example. If you have erratic hand movements, as I do, you might spill coffee quite often. And so imagine the situation pre-COVID, and hopefully soon again also here in New York, we still have most coffee shops being quite guarded. But imagine the situation, you're in a coffee shop and you spill the coffee, and there's this person next to you, and you sense there might be this kind of connection. You sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is, but you know, now you have a couple of options. Like you unexpectedly spill the coffee, but you know, do you just say, oh, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin, and then you walk outside and you wonder, what could have been if I would have talked with this person? Or do you essentially start a conversation, you know, and kind of somehow see what could be there? That's obviously the part, like the gist of a lot of love stories, where people essentially have these unexpected encounters in a bookstore or in a coffee shop or something, where someone has to do something with that unexpected. At the moment in COVID times, of course, a lot of times we see that companies in particular have a lot of unexpected moments happen. Here you see a brewery in Cambodia, but you see that around the world, that realized unexpectedly in some of the meetings, well, you know, we can't really sell our alcohol to restaurants at the moment, but maybe what we can do is we can use the alcohol for hand sanitizers. And so that unexpected kind of collective moment of COVID essentially turned them into a completely different type of business. But essentially they saw something in the unexpected and realized they can really develop a hand sanitizer business around that. This one here is one of my favorites. You might all remember, those of you especially who are in Europe, a couple of years ago, there was this volcano with a completely unpronounceable name. A friend of mine in Iceland at some point said, Christian, you're stupid trying to pronounce this name. Like just say E and then 14. So 14 letters, whatever the letters are, it's just the letters. And so this volcano broke out. You know, you might remember the ash cloud that was over London and the whole of Europe. And in London, all planes were grounded. So essentially nobody got out of the country via plane. Some people took the ship, which was very entrepreneurial, I guess, but essentially most people were grounded. And at that point, there was the biggest social entrepreneurship forum in the world, the Skoll World Forum, happening in Oxford. And all these people were stuck in London. And so I got a call on a Saturday morning, you know, I was very sleepy and just got out of bed. and it was an unknown number. And I was curious, okay, let's see what that is. And there was someone on the other end of the line who was like, hey, Christian, we don't know each other yet, but a mutual friend gave me your number, and my name is Nathaniel, and I'm stuck in London with all the other participants of the Skull World Forum, and they're all essentially just hanging around. Like, they had their schedules cleared. They don't know what to do. There was pre-Netflix, they were just essentially out and about. And so he was like, why don't I bring all these people together at a conference? So within 30 hours, he organized TEDx Volcano, which was a full-fledged TEDx conference with amazing speakers like Jeff Skoll speaking, over 10,000 people on the recorded live stream, one of the most successful TEDx type conferences ever. And he did that with essentially almost no resources, but he did that in a way because he saw something in the unexpected. He saw that unexpected event, and then he went to TED and said, hey, you're all about like inspiring stories around opportunity, so maybe we can turn this into a story of opportunity. And then he got all these local co-working spaces and others to jump in because they liked that momentum and so on. But again, he like everyone else encountered a big kind of unexpected thing, but he did something with it. He connected the dots, and then it gave him like an amazing visibility and so on right after. Now here's one of my favorite examples. Usually I would ask you now, who of you has heard of it? And usually it's a good sign if you haven't, because this is essentially where a couple of decades ago, a couple of researchers were testing a medication against or for angina with some of their study participants, and they realized that there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And what would we usually do? We would say, wow, this is embarrassing. Like, this movement like shouldn't happen, and if you give something like a medication. So what we would usually do probably is to either ignore the embarrassing problem, or to essentially say, oh, let's find a better way to cure angina that doesn't have that quote unquote side effect. They did the opposite. They said, you know what, this is unexpected, but a lot of people in the world might have a problem in that department. So why don't we essentially make that a medication itself and call it Viagra or else? And so this is how Viagra and other medications along those lines emerged. Again, completely serendipitous. And that's also one of these things where around 50% of inventions and innovations tend to be serendipitous. We're looking for something completely different, but then, by accident, come across something like this and see that. And then last but not least, this is one of my favorites out of China. It's a company I've been working with quite a bit, and they got calls a couple of years ago from farmers. And so that company is selling washing machines and refrigerators. And they got calls from farmers who said, well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in your washing machine, but it always breaks down. And so, what would we usually say? We would say, well, this is a washing machine. Like, don't wash your potatoes in our washing machine. Like, wash your clothes, and that's it, right? What did they do? They did the opposite. They said, you know what? It's unexpected that they're washing their potatoes in the washing machine. But you know what? There's a lot of farmers in China who might have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? So that's how the potato washing machine serendipitously emerged. The point with all these examples is what they all have in common is that it's not just about an event that happens to us, right? It's not about just something like blind luck where we inherit something or we are born into a good family or something like that. But it's essentially, there's always some kind of trigger, right? Like the coffee being spilled, the volcano breaking out, and the ash cloud being there, the farmers calling about potatoes and stuff like that. But then we have to do something with it. We have to connect the dots. We have to see something in that moment and connect it to something relevant. And then we have to have the tenacity to actually do something with it and follow through with it. And so the beauty of this is then that what happens then is that serendipity becomes a process that we can influence, because at every of these steps, we can influence the trigger. We can create more meaningful accidents. And I talk about this later on, that we can essentially cultivate more of these kind of potential dots that are out there. We can seed them, but also we can connect them. We can learn how to connect them better and really do something with it. And of course, we can work on our grids and other things that help us to really turn that into something. And then essentially what we're doing is we're creating smart luck. We're setting ourselves up for smart luck by turning the unexpected into positive outcomes. Now, one of the things that happens, of course, all the time is that we're missing serendipity all the time. Essentially, either because we don't see the trigger, if we don't see something like in the case of Viagra as an opportunity, if we just see it as an embarrassing side effect, then essentially we will not even realize that there is something. We might miss connecting the dots, so not doing something with it. Or what happens a lot of times, of course, is that we might see something, We might know what we could do with it, but then we might not have the tenacity to actually go through with it. Now, the question is, and I wanted to briefly just drive this point home in terms of how much it is also about how we look at the world. There's a lot of experiments around luck, and some of the most interesting experiments around luck are really around the question of how do we look at the world in a way that allows us to have more luck in our lives. And there's a fascinating study that has been done in the UK, where they picked one person who self-identifies as very lucky and one person who self-identifies as very unlucky. And they told them, you know what, walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, order a coffee, and sit down. That's it. And then we'll have the interview, nothing else. What they didn't tell them is that there's hidden cameras across the street. There's only one table or one seat in the coffee shop that's empty next to this extremely successful businessman who can make dreams happen. And there's a £5 note in front of the door that's just being placed. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, has a nice conversation with the barista, sits next to the businessman, has a conversation, they make friends, exchange business cards, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it, we don't know that. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, the other person's left, ignores the businessman, that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the streets, I made new friends, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it, but we don't know that. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And we probably all know these situations in our own lives where we see some people that are just a bit luckier than others, even though they have exactly the same situations. I mean, look at some couples, they might meet exactly the same people, they might be in exactly the same situations, but by the way they look at the world, how they frame questions, and a couple of other things that we'll talk about in a second, they essentially reframe the world in ways that allows them to have more luck and have these kind of things happen. Now, how do we know this? How do we know that serendipity happens, or if it happens, or if it doesn't happen? A lot of my work has been qualitative. So essentially, we're trying to understand over time, how does this process unfold? And then we compare different ones with each other. And one of the most interesting ones, of course, is if you have the same situation happen that is unexpected, and you see one creating serendipity, creating some positive outcome out of it, and the other one not. And that is actually something that has been discussed quite a bit in the literature as well. So for example, there's one, there were a couple of researchers a couple of decades ago that were researching the effect of papain, the enzyme. They were injecting rabbits with that enzyme, and they saw that the rabbits' ears flopped. And you know, that was unexpected. They didn't understand why the rabbits' ears flopped. And you know, they both saw it, but only one of them actually acted on it. And you know, he kind of dove deeper into it, and that led into a whole stream that led into kind of arthritis research, because the bloodstream was so accelerated that it would help arthritis to essentially be tackled. And the point here being that essentially we can look at the counterfactual, what could have happened or what would have happened, but also we can look at alternative life histories and what other things that actually unfolded and that came about. Another way, the simple way is the coffee shop example I mentioned earlier, where essentially you're just thinking about what could have happened, the real counterfactual, if you had acted differently. One of the things though that I found super fascinating over the last kind of like years now of writing the book is that once we see that serendipity is there, it happens all the time and so on, it also like makes us question what is actually a positive outcome. Like, is a positive outcome about turning something, you know, is it about success, whatever it is? And I remember going to my publisher when I had the first version of the manuscript, and I was like, hey, here's the manuscript. And they were like, look, we really like this, but we need more love stories. And I was like, well, I'm not sure if I, you know, as a then single 35-year-old, if I am the right person to talk about love. Like, you know, what do I know about love? And they were like, look, but let's see if we can find something. And so essentially, we, you know, discussed, okay, let's do that. Right after that, I had a meeting with my, with an ex-girlfriend of mine, who's a very close friend of mine now. And we met for coffee. And I asked her, do you know of any cool love stories that I could use for the book? And she's like, well, our story. And I was like, what do you mean our story? Like, we're not together anymore. Where's the success here? Where's the positive outcome? And she was like, well, look, we met coincidentally in a Starbucks. We kind of, you know, went on a joint journey. We gave each other emotional support. We, in a way, introduced each other to interesting people that then put us on different trajectories where we are today now. So even if we're not together anymore, we essentially were such an important part in our lives that that shaped who we are today. And so it made me really rethink a lot of the things in terms of, what do we think about as success, and also how over time, a lot of times what might seem as bad luck at the moment might actually unfold as something positive in the long run. And that is really something with serendipity, that a lot of times it has this incubation time. It a lot of times might start out with a bit of like unexpected crises or something, but then turn into something positive. Now, what's of course important is to think about that we don't all start at the same base level, right? So I here in the West Village in New York, I have access to interesting networks, I have interesting kind of access to education and so on, versus like when I go to Kibera, one of the biggest impoverished areas in the world, there is a constant noise level, people can't really focus on things, there's not those kind of networks. So the potential serendipity base level is very different for me than for someone in that context. So going hand in hand with the serendipity mindset is of course removing structural constraints and really trying to understand how we can do both at the same time. How can we set up scholarships, for example, that develop a serendipity base level or serendipity space for people, and so on. And those of you interested, I'd be delighted to dive deeper. But I'd love to wrap this up, and then we'll dive into a Q&A session with just a couple of short ideas on some of the practices, because especially at times like at the moment, I feel Hubert Joly, the former chairman of Best Buy, said it beautifully, that the way we deal with the unexpected defines who we are, right? We see at the moment in unexpected times, we see the true colors of leaders, we see who acts how, we see who really brings out what in each other, and really developing this muscle for the unexpected becomes absolutely crucial in that time. Now, how do we do that? One of my absolute favorites is asking questions differently, because we can integrate that into every aspect of our life. There's again, instead of asking the kind of what do you do question, how can we ask questions more around, hey, what inspired you in this presentation, or what is on your mind at the moment, or just something that opens up the kind of spectrum of potential dots that could be connected. But more importantly, there's the question of how do we answer to that question, right? If someone asks us this dreaded what do you do question, do we just say, oh, I'm in technology, or do we say something like, well, I'm an education entrepreneur, I just started playing the piano, but what I'm really excited about is reading into the philosophy of science. And so what we're doing here is we're seeding different hooks where someone could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence, I just started hosting piano matinees, you should come by. Or, oh my God, such a coincidence, I just started reading into philosophy of XYZ, we should connect. Whatever it is, the idea is seizing into every conversation a couple of hooks where the other person could connect the dots for us by seeing something in there that might be of interest to them. Another way is, of course, to look at mistakes or crises differently. We talked about the example of Viagra, that once we see something in the moment, we can do something with it. There's also really cool practices. If we have time later, I'd love to talk about one, which is the Project Funeral, which is one of my absolute favorites, which is all about saying, how do we essentially, if an idea in an organization doesn't work out, how do we then make sure that we still figure out how we can use that or reuse that in some other way, rather than just hiding it away. We can also reframe situations. This is a fascinating one where a lot of our work has been in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there's this organization, Reconstructed Living Labs, RLabs. And essentially they come out of a very impoverished community. And one of the things that they do differently is that they are going into a new context, into a new community. And instead of asking something like, what do you need, right? Which essentially is the budget approach, which is the approach of asking for resources. They say, what is already here and how can we make the best out of it? And by doing this, essentially what they achieve is that everyone first thinks about, oh, there's an old garage, fantastic, that could be a training center. Oh, there's a former drug dealer or a former drug user, that could be a potential teacher. The social capital they have is wonderful. And so essentially then all these unexpected solutions emerge because people are not thinking about a particular solution and how to get the money for it, but they're thinking about what is here and how could we come up with a new solution here. And I'll talk more about this later, I think, in relation to some of the questions, if that comes up, how that approach is really at the core of a lot of this. There's also a lot around how we can enable serendipity spotting. So how we can, in meetings and other things, ask people what surprised you last week, or did you question the assumptions last week, or something, anything that brings up what might have been there before. And then, of course, the question of how in a COVID world, we can leverage technology. That is something, the traditional water cooler moment where you would just bump into a colleague and come up with, maybe in Connson place, a new paper or a new course or so. These water cooler moments, of course, are reduced at the moment. but we can recreate them in a lot of ways. So for example, companies like Google and others, they have something like random coffee trials where they ask employees, when do you have time? Give us one time slot. And then they randomly pair them up with someone else in the organization, give them an inspiring prompt or so, and then they meet for coffee for an hour and just talk about something. And usually a lot of times that leads to kind of unexpected insights. Last but not least, and this is one of my favorites, is really the idea of developing some kind of North Star, some kind of purpose, or even just a curiosity, because the more we have a sense of direction, the more it allows us to also connect the dots to it and to really do something with it. And so that is really something I found that interesting here in New York with Governor Cuomo, who essentially was really good at saying, I will not just give you an exact plan of, like an exact timeline. What I will do is I will give you two principles, which is public health and economic health, and then I will give you an approximate timeline. But I tell you already now that I will adjust this timeline based on unexpected information. What he's doing here is he's giving us a clear North Star, but he's ready for the unexpected, as opposed to all these other governors who are essentially setting up a timetable, then they have to revise the timetable, which either makes them look as if they don't understand the dynamic, or they have to hide the data coming in. And so essentially by having like not an overfixed plan, but rather a sense of direction, and then kind of an idea of the unexpected emerging, it gives us that, and that comes a lot of our research as well. For example, in terms of purpose-driven leaders, there's a Leaders on Purpose report we just did with CEOs, where it is exactly this, like they are really good at saying, this is the sense of direction, and now we're open to which strategy unfolds. Now, the philosophy, or the philosopher in me being the German I am, I have to wrap this up with a philosophical note, which is that, and before I do this, of course, I want to give a big thanks to everyone who has been part of this journey, which is of course Penguin Random House, who has been, especially through COVID times, a brilliant support in terms of, on the editing side, on the communication side, and so on. So thank you so much to Emily, Julia, and the team for really kind of pushing this forward. Also to Curtis Brown, my agent there has been fantastic, Gordon, and the NYU Center for Global Affairs, and of course here the Marshall Institute. Thank you so much for your support. I think those kind of ideas, I remember when I started a couple of years ago researching into that topic, it was that kind of area where people would say, oh, can you actually research this? And I think having people like you supporting something like this, which hopefully becomes now a serious research stream with kind of first top papers and so on, is really something that I'm personally excited about, to give legitimacy also to something that seems to be more scientific than we thought it might actually be, and to really rigorously embedding that into the debate. And so I'd love everyone to send in stories. If you have interesting stories, please do send them over. Please tweet them for the next editions and for all the frameworks we're building at the moment. The more stories, the merrier. And also, I'd love to personally talk about it. Now, wrapping this up philosophically, I grew up in Heidelberg, where Goethe and Schiller wrote a lot of their poems. And Goethe had this beautiful idea that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take someone as they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can be. And that is really the core spirit behind serendipity, that serendipity is about potentiality. It is about what could be. It's not about saying, if you are XYZ, you will always be XYZ, but it's about saying, oh, what could be out there? Could there be something new, something meaningful, something purposeful? And this is really something that we've been working a lot on also here in the Marshall Center, to really say, let's question all these structures, let's question all these kind of different ideas and assumptions. And by doing this, we enable people to become their potential most aligned self. And so that's really what this is about in a more philosophical sense. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion now. And thank you so much for joining.
Great. Thank you, Christian. So I'm going to take the chair's privilege to ask the first question. But while I ask that question, I just wanted to remind those of you who are adding questions to the Q&A, just scroll through what's already in there, because you can like someone else's question. If you're intending to ask something similar to what has already been asked, add a like to it, and then it'll move up to the top of the queue. And then I'll ask that question first. So my question, having read your book, Christian, is in your book, you discuss creating serendipity through strategies such as having an artist mindset, fostering an environment where it's safe to fail or to learn from failure. Now, these are also strategies for nurturing creativity. How is serendipity different from creativity?
Yeah, That's a great question, because I remember back in the days when Steve Jobs, he had these beautiful ideas, obviously, around how creatives always feel guilty because they always see something in the moment and do something with it and connect one idea with another. And that kind of then usually leads to something where they didn't work necessarily that much for it, but it came to them a lot of times. But obviously there's a lot of work behind that, right? And so it's really, in a way, there's a lot we can learn from serendipity, from creativity. And one of the things actually that if you look at the process of serendipity, you know, the creativity part is a lot about the connecting dots part, right? It's a lot about how do we essentially like connect A with B and then come up with something interesting around this. And this is, being honest, one of the beauties of the book, that in a way, like that we can anchor serendipity, the process, in these different areas, in terms of we can learn from creativity around how do you connect dots better. We can learn from physics, how energy works and how energy kind of, or even quantum physics in that regard. We can learn from other areas. And so I think in those respects, like when it comes to creativity, when it comes to bricolage and all these different other aspects, there's pieces we can learn from. And it's almost like this Venn diagram where then we can see, oh, the connecting the dots is similar, but then, you know, the kind of developing a mindset that can create smart luck is a bit different. And so we can play around with that.
So serendipity is a little bit like the system that's the overlap of all these different Venn diagrams. It's that system that's created from the interaction of all these different, like creativity and other skills. And actually extroversion, I mean, do you need to be extroverted in order to create serendipity?
Great question, because I mean, as a closet introvert, you know, I'm this kind of passionate introvert who I have spikes of extroversion. Everyone, you know, who only knows me in a public context would be like, oh my God, you're the most extroverted person out there. But actually then I have to hide in my living room for a couple of hours to just kind of get that energy back. And so I thought about this a lot, and there's also quite a bit of work around how the way extroverts function, or if we look at a kind of continuum between extroversion and introversion, and you know, the more extrovert we are, the more we might have access to people, access to networks. We might follow up differently with people. People might react differently to us, right? So that is all good for having more triggers. But then actually, when it comes to connecting the dots, the more reflective introvert piece actually can be really effective in seeing the value in something and really doing something with it. So what we're seeing a lot is that a lot of times extroverts really benefit from kind of having an introvert partner or someone else who helps them reflect and ground some of these things. But also introverts themselves can do a lot about, you know, even if you don't want to put yourself out there directly, you can find indirect ways. And a lot of serendipity, of course, doesn't necessarily happen via people. It can happen by looking at a bookshelf and getting an inspiring idea, or it can happen at like reading a newspaper, which happens a lot of times, right? And you come up with an idea and so on. So there's as much for introverts as for extroverts, but certainly there's a lot to learn also from how can we take what could be potentially the beneficial things that an extrovert does, like interacting with a lot of people, without having to do it. So for example, when I'm at an event, like the first thing I do is I talk with the host, and I try to tell the host about an exciting idea and try to incentivize them to then talk with other people about that idea so that I don't have to talk about it. And so essentially, what's happening here is that we're feeding this to other people, and we almost outsource the extroversion to other people, and then they can go ahead with it. And there's a lot of these kind of strategies where we as introverts can actually have other people be extroverted about it.
Great. No, thank you. Okay, let me get to the audience questions now. And we've got one that's a very popular question. So 18 votes for this one. So environment aside, how much does one's self-confidence factor into this? Do more confident and extrovert people seem to have more luck? So is the issue one of becoming more confident for some people?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of work around exactly that question. Thank you, by the way, Ben, for this wonderful question. And it's wonderful with the vote ups. Thank you everyone for engaging with it to see that. So there's a lot of work around exactly that. In a way, the way we act on opportunities. So even if we see a potential opportunity, we might not act on it, right? Because we all might have a hidden imposter in us, or imposter syndrome, or we all might kind of like, you know, have something in there. And I remember this conversation with a wonderful restaurant, someone who's running a restaurant in London, who I asked him, so how much serendipity do you have in your life? And he would be like, before 25, never, and after 25, all the time. And we were trying to explore like what changed. And he was like, look, I went through a journey during that time where I promised myself that I am worthy. I promised myself that I am worthy of opportunity, because he would be the kind of person who would work as a waiter, and he has such a great energy and he has such a positive attitude that people would always offer him things. They would always say, hey, look, someone like you should work for XYZ company that I just set up. Why don't you join us? And he would always say no, because he wouldn't trust that he could actually do it. And so he had this kind of lack of self-confidence and so on. And, you know, in his head, it was always, people like me are not supposed to do X, Y, Z. People like me are supposed to be in this business, in this service industry, and we're not supposed to do the big things and X, Y, Z. And I've seen that a lot with, I think, especially people who are growing up in environments where maybe they didn't get that kind of feeling of self-worth or feeling of self-confidence, that they're, of course, like it holds back sometimes, that kind of questioning, self-doubt and so on. And there's definitely, that's also where a lot of the kind of work we've been doing around it is around how do we overcome this? So how do we set ourselves up psychologically, but also how do we set up an environment for it? Again, if you're a leader, how do you like develop psychological safety for people that they feel they can speak up because they feel comfortable speaking up rather than being shot down? And so in the company context, I always find it interesting when you think about what makes a good culture, because the good culture, of course, comes a lot from people feeling that they will not be talked about if something doesn't work out and so on. And so we could talk about this later, but I think on the individual level, yes, there's definitely kind of a lot in there in terms of that feeling of self-worth, self-confidence, and so on has a huge effect, and that we can work on this. But at the same time, also that there are kind of, you know, concrete things we can do about it that help us to get to that point.
Great, thank you. Next, would you consider the pandemic has brought more opportunity than challenges?
You know, it's interesting. So I had COVID in March, like a severe, you know, I couldn't breathe, and it was like a heavy period. And it's like in the moment, these things, of course, always feel really tough, right, and rough, and so on. And at the same time, when I think back on my life and when I look at a lot of the research we've been doing, when you trace people over time, a lot of their most interesting moments in life and the most serendipitous moments in life, a lot of times came out of moments of crisis, out of moments of that kind of challenging situation. And I think COVID was interesting because obviously it's almost like been a collective near-death experience, right? Like that everyone from one day to the other, we were all put into our small boxes at home, and without kind of any social connection, which obviously is at the core of our lived experience to somehow interact with other people. We were like a lot of things that we took for granted were taken away. So in a way, there's this void which forced a lot of us to dive deeper into what is meaningful to me, what do I really want in life, and so my deep belief is that this is a period where we can, in a way, probably we will look back in 10 years from now and say, wow, like this was an interesting reassessment period that allowed us to rethink about, did I really want to become XYZ person, or do I just want to, you know, live XYZ life, and I rethink what is really important to me. And, you know, when you asked that question, it reminded me of, there's this wonderful article about deathbed regrets. And it's so much about the question of when people are on their deathbed, they never say something like, I wished I had focused, I wished I had stayed 2 more hours on the job, or I wished I had, like, you know, like all these kind of trivial things, but they usually say, I wished I had built more meaningful relationships with the people I really care about. And like things that I think are reinforced at the moment because we're trying to figure out what life is really about in those periods and use that as an anchor for whatever comes next. And so I think, yes, I feel like this at the moment is both kind of on a more like holistic level an amazing opportunity because we have that kind of space, but also a lot of the opportunities that I'm seeing at the moment where, you know, I mentioned the example of the brewery becoming a hand sanitizer company. I see a lot of innovation happening at the moment where out of resource constraints, people develop really interesting creative stuff. And, you know, it reminds me a lot of like a lot of my work in resource constrained environments where out of necessity, that's where the really interesting innovation and the really impactful innovation emerges because you just don't have any other choice. And so it's really interesting, I think, also in terms of innovation and everything else that we're seeing already, but we will also see much more. The really interesting things happening now that actually are not just incremental, let's build a better like ATM machine type things, but let's rethink how we work, let's rethink how we go about life. And I think it's a really interesting period from a lot of perspectives, environmental, societal, and so on. And so I'm very hopeful for it.
Well, and if we fit this into your model, the pandemic is a trigger. And so you could either see the trigger as a challenge and then you miss out on all the opportunities, or you could connect the dots and turn it into some kind of serendipity.
Exactly.
Okay, do you view serendipity being pretty much the same as the growth mindset theory, Carol Dweck?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the growth mindset obviously is all about saying, okay, how do I constantly kind of see things as learning opportunities and grow from that and really, you know, do something out of this. And again, it's similar to the creativity aspect that I think there's a lot we can learn from that. There's a lot we can learn from how we look at the world of this. And then again, I think if we look at it as a Venn diagram, we have the growth aspect that is certainly there. And then I think we have the other aspects, which are much more around how do we essentially see something in the unexpected? How do we do something with the unexpected? How do we turn that into something? So I think there's definitely around this, but highly recommended the growth mindset book because it's certainly been a great inspiration to me in terms of how you think about how to not be in a fixed state of assuming that, you know, I am supposed to be XYZ person. I will always be that person to how do I become someone else and how do I believe I can become someone else? And so it's psychologically, actually, it's part of the psychological section of the book around how we actually try to understand how we can grow and become, and then make that part of that overall framework.
Yeah. So just like creativity, it's growth mindset is one of those ingredients that you need, but it's not the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. As serendipity is difficult to predict and its effect is difficult to measure, and organizations love predictability and measurable things, how do you suggest making the business case for serendipity to organizations in a way that they understand it and buy into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of my work is with companies around exactly this. And I think one of the things that I've seen work pretty well is seeing it as a way of people connecting more with the company. So essentially, once we start saying, hey, can everyone tell us a serendipity story in relation to XYZ company? Then essentially we're creating beautiful stories. And based on the stories, we're seeing, oh, there's a certain pattern. It seems like 50% of our innovations are coming from these serendipitous things, or it seems like, so that is the one thing to really kind of understand the patterns behind the stories. There's obviously a huge kind of aspect on the kind of marketing side and everything else of how beautiful serendipitous stories tend to be. And everyone has a serendipity story. So it's a lot of times also beautiful for the company itself to be kind of like, to in a way, humanizing the company in that sense. But most importantly, so there's companies that have done very concrete things such as, for example, incentivizing that five times a week, people were incentivized to look out for something unexpected in a marketing plan, for example. And so literally they were put into the mindset of, we want you to find something unexpected in there. Tell us what is unexpected in there and go in there. And then what you can show is that essentially, let's say you have a washing machine plan, right? That shows you, oh, we're predicting to have these washing machines being sold. And then you see, oh, there's quite a few farmers telling us it breaks down because of potatoes. Actually, instead of trying to ignore this because it doesn't fit into your marketing plan, you're saying, hey, this will save us a lot of costs later, because if we're now just producing these washing machines and we're not producing this, we're missing out on this whole market. We're missing out on XYZ. The same with defects, right? If we see unexpected defective things happening very early on, and we're incentivized to look at it and see it, essentially it helps us do that more often. So we can do a lot of calculations around, you know, what is the kind of potential revenue coming out of it, but also what is the cost we're saving from this. And so there's a lot of work. If you're interested, please do feel free to reach out. There's a lot of work around how, especially in companies, that helps us a lot, both in terms of the innovation side, the cost side, but also the kind of story side and the human element of getting people excited and getting them, that comes back to the purpose part, right? Like that at the end of the day, if you think about attracting and retaining the most excited talent, what you want to do is you want to relate that somehow to a bigger purpose. And a lot of times that comes from this joy that comes from the potentiality of serendipity, and that there could be something in there.
So it's basically taking the data you're already collecting and looking at it in a different way.
A lot of times, yes. And I found that to be the most effective way, because it essentially doesn't add any more work or something, right? It's a very cost-effective way of saying, hey, great, we can actually use this and then do something with it directly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Do you have a definition of luck? What percentage of life do you think is luck?
That's a great question. Oh, it reminds me, by the way, we also wanted to briefly launch a survey. So right after this, after I answer this question, please, Connson, if I forget, please do remind me. I'm in this period of my life where I tend to forget a lot of things, but I think it's we will try to remember that. But it's a great question, and if you think about it that way, you know, I wouldn't be able to put a percentage number on it. It's very idiosyncratic, but in terms of each person's life. But what I can do is, so we know from research that in management, for example, around 50% of things are unexplained variance. So if you essentially write a business plan and everything else, it is relatively likely that you will run into someone the next day who tells you about something completely different, and you completely like pivot and adjust to something completely different, which will look as very lucky when you look back. So that happens in a lot of cases, up to 50% innovations, inventions. And I would just kind of, in a way, encourage looking back on your own lives and say, which kind of situations seem lucky? But when I look at it now from this perspective, I had a role in it. Like I didn't just inherit something here passively, but actually I had a proactive decision that I made in that moment, which then made me end up with my partner or with my co-founder and everything else. And so I think that is really coming back to the differentiation earlier, that there's a bit of like blind luck happening in life that we can't influence. And I think that's the part which, well, it just happens, and there's not that much we can do about it, at least not that I know of, but there's a lot we can do about this smart luck, and it does happen. And that's, I think, why it's so important to do something like a serendipity journal or something else that gets us into the mindset of, oh, this is how today I will use a meeting to instill a little bit of serendipity into it, because essentially what's happening then is you see the shift from week 1 where you don't do that to week 2 where you have that happening more and more. And so what I thought the first, it was one of those questions where I would love to answer it in 20 different ways, but for the sake of time, I will only use that one, which is really kind of saying that in a way we can program ourselves to have more of that serendipity, and then we can literally see our own development from week 1 to week 10, how much more serendipity and luck we have happened because we did small behavioral changes, like the way we ask questions, like how we put ourselves out there and so on. And I think that to me is a really interesting thing, that then luck tends to happen much more often than if we don't do this. And so one of the things we have in the book is really this kind of serendipity score, which is all about saying, like try to score yourself this week and then check out where you are in 5 weeks when you go through these practices. And I've always found it fascinating. You do a workshop around this or something, and after a week, people are like, oh my God, like serendipity starts to happen all the time now. And I find that fascinating, how quickly we can have immediate effects rather than, I used to work on social impact before, where the results take you years and years, and you only get an email after 5 years where someone says, thank you, we had this impact now. Whereas with serendipity, it's very immediate. And so I think the more you write this down, the more you get yourself into it, the more it starts to happen. And that's the joy and the beauty that then comes from it.
Which by the way, I thought was a great part of the book. At the end of each chapter, there's something called a serendipity workout. And it actually has things you can do right away to start building serendipity in your life. I thought that was a really nice touch. Do we want to run the poll now? We want to find out.
Good point. Yes,
if you think of yourself as lucky or not. So please answer the poll. We would love to know.
Very lucky audience, indeed. I'd be curious to see if this would have changed, if we would have asked you at the beginning and then at the end. Next time we'll do that.
I think so.
But that's that's fascinating to see. So thank you so much. So we had 85%. I don't know if you've seen that, but 85% of people in the audience consider themselves to be lucky. Now, again, we might have pre-framed you a little bit, so next time we'll do that at the beginning. But that's great to hear, and it's great to see. By the way, thank you so much for the questions. I mean, maybe we'll find a way. Those questions we can't answer now. Maybe we find a way to feedback it later or else.
Yeah. So the next popular question is, are you familiar with positive psychology, and have you used any of those ideas in your work?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So one of the key protagonists in the book, actually, Nico Rose, he is one of the kind of Seligman type inspired ones, and it's interesting because we a lot of if we think about of positive psychology as kind of the idea of how do we focus on strengths and behaviors that allow us to somehow do something and to move towards that flourishing. It's really about, identifying what makes a good life and do something with it. And so there's definitely a lot around this in the book, around how we try to understand it, a meaningful life. How do we try to understand what's at the core of this? Yeah, I mean, I think we could definitely also, those of you who are interested, Nico Rose is his name, the wonderful person in the book who also brought in a lot of thoughts around this in that case. So I highly recommend checking him out as well. But again, it's really coming back to the Venn diagram bit, that like there it's really about this kind of reinforcement of strengths and so on that plays one part, and then you have the other pieces that are coming together. So yes, it does play a big role.
Great. Now this one, you did say a little bit about this earlier, but maybe say a bit more. With the office, restaurant, and city streets acting as places for these incidental conversations and unexpected encounters, do you think COVID-19 has changed serendipity with reduced impersonal socializing and interactions, or do you think the internet can replace this?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think, I mean, initially, I've seen it in my own life, and people around us, how much it cut off, right, in terms of the personal interactions that can lead to serendipity. And then, what I think a lot of people have tried to do is try to replicate this as much as possible. So for example, here in New York, you will see that you have dating platforms, for example, where you can go for dinner with 8 people, and then you have a group dinner, right, which usually obviously is where you meet someone. And then you have that group dinner, and then you can go into breakout rooms if you like each other, and then you kind of continue in the breakout room. And again, these are things that are not ideal, right? It's not the kind of same thing, but it's trying to replicate a lot of this. So yes, there was a bit, quite a big of a cutoff in terms of that serendipity happening out there. But at the same time, I think there's more and more smart solutions, as I mentioned earlier, also around this kind of random coffee trials within companies that try to recreate water cooler moments, or one of my favorites actually in real life that also can be replicated in some way in online life is something I've used a lot in the work with people who come from less privileged backgrounds. Because when you come from a less privileged background, a lot of times you don't have real access to opportunity, to networks and everything else. And so one idea there is to say, go to events at the LSE, at the RSA, at other kind of public institutions, and be the first person who asked the question, right? So let's say there's an inspiring speaker, a CEO of something, or like a president or whatever. And in real life, you would kind of be the one who like energetically stands up. And here you would be the one who maybe asks 5 questions in the chat, and one of them will probably get upvoted, and you put your name and like maybe 1 or 2 context sentences. And what's happening a lot of times then is that the way we would frame it is to say, hey, look, thank you so much for this inspiring speech. It was wonderful. So making it all about the speaker, and then like having this middle sentence which says something like, as someone who just went through XYZ transition, so whatever we feel comfortable sharing. Sometimes they would be something like, very transparent, saying I just came out of prison and I'm looking for XYZ, or whatever it is. Do you have some advice what someone in my situation can do? And so what we're doing here is we're making it about the speaker, we're making it about a broader question that is about someone like me, but we insert this middle sentence that has all that potentiality in that. And usually what always happens, both offline and now online, I've seen it happen as well, is that essentially there's always 4 or 5 people in the audience who would say, oh my God, such a coincidence, my brother recently went through a similar period, I want to put you in touch. Or, oh my God, such a coincidence, my sister might have a job for you. Whatever it is, like there's always some kind of like coincidental thing, because you put some dots out there, and that we can do online as well, not in the same way and a bit more restricted. But I think online, the beauty of course is that everything is a bit more scalable, a bit more kind of, you can do a lot of more things out there. For example, also, sending serendipity bombs, like in the way of saying, LinkedIn, for example, has this in-mail function where you can reach a lot of second degrees, or essentially all second degrees. So if I know Connson, I can now write a message to all of her contacts where I can be like, hey, I've been so inspired by your work, and I just was wondering about XYZ, whatever it is, just something that's not pitching, but it's about putting oneself on the radar of other people. And I think at times like these, this is wonderful because everyone's at home, right? Everyone's online. So even these heavy hitters who usually might not be that available online are actually available online now. And so it's a huge opportunity to see the couple of things, especially if we're looking for jobs, for example, putting on the radar now, where in 6 months from now, someone might be like, oh my God, yeah, I came across this person half a year ago, and now I remember I need XYZ. and putting that together. So I think online can be a great opportunity if we seed some of these serendipity bombs and really make use of this because it has that scale.
Yeah, and online is very different. I mean, this online Q&A is a much more democratic process than people raising their hands. So here we've got a question that got 7 votes. It says, my name is Emerson Sutton and I'm 13 years old. To date, I've been very successful with my opportunities. How do I ensure that this continues with even more competitors?
Well, first of all, Emerson, I mean, congratulations. That sounds wonderful that you're already kind of in that mindset and going out there and changing the world. So please do continue to do that. That's wonderful. And thank you, Ellen, for posting it. I think it's interesting because you know, one thing that a lot of our work has also shown. I think if we look at the world in terms of competition, one thing that might be dangerous is that then, yes, we see that there's more and more people who might compete with us, versus if we look at it in terms of, hey, all these people could become potential allies if I position myself for a particular area or for a particular field or theme. Or so if you feel there's some kind of passion that's in you or something that is there, yes, there will always be some kind of competition. But at the end of the day, I think the older you will grow and the more you will do in the world, the more also there might be kind of themes where essentially you can do your own thing, and then other people will not be competitors, but they will be your collaborators who are really kind of with you on this journey. And I think in a way you seem to have that mindset already. I would probably say, you know, doing something like a journal that helps you to think about what was it about these opportunities that you got that like worked well. So why did you get these? What was it about what you did that really helped you do it? How can you build on this? But also were there situations where it didn't work, and what was it about them? What could you do differently? And once you start writing this down, I think it will help you to build on this and to really kind of iterate on this. And then if you combine this with some of the things we talked about today and really kind of keep that open mind, I'm pretty sure, you know, you will continue being out there in the world, having a lot of opportunities, and kudos for doing this. And it's wonderful that you're with us here today. So thank you for joining us also.
Yeah, and I think, Christian, what you said about competitors are not always competitors. There's this concept of co-opetition, where competitors can sometimes be people you help each other. Okay, in an age when many of us are building wonky careers and living multidimensional lives, what do you suggest as the most effective hook selection process? With so many more hooks in our pockets, how do we know which hooks to hook or seeds to plant in conversations?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think it also comes to the question of filters, right? In a way, I think a lot of us who have a lot of serendipity happening, one key challenge is how do you filter opportunities? How do you make sense that you don't just get distracted, right? If you have 3 portfolio elements in your thing, if you're freelancing in software and you're at the same time working on a book and at the same time you're doing a third thing, then of course there's the risk of getting distracted very easily. And so what I found very interesting as a filter is the North Star we talked about. So really kind of understanding what is my key priority at this point, where I want to head towards, and how does everything fit into this? And if it doesn't fit into this, maybe it's not for me at this point. So Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, he's been really good at this. Like he always works on a lot of projects, but he seems to people outside that he's distracted, but actually he's extremely focused. Like he has this clear idea of where I want to go is I want to have a platform that allows me to help people who can't help themselves. Like that's his kind of like broader theme and North Star. And if things fit into that, then he will place that into the different projects. If not, he will just say no. And so I think like learning or finding a way that helps to say, there's an umbrella for all these projects, and the umbrella might be XYZ, whatever that umbrella is in that case. And only things that fit into that umbrella are the general hooks. And then for the specific hooks, it's really the prioritization then, right? So for example, I just went through this process when writing the book, but you know, I'm always excited about serendipity in terms of so many different areas, but when writing the book, it was clear that has to be the priority. And I actually had to close down to serendipity a lot. And I was only looking for serendipity that actually would be about how can more people learn about the book? How can I make sure that mindset gets into every school, every high school, every university, and like really focusing on serendipity around this. And people around me knew that then, so they would only come to me with potential dots connected that relate to this. And so I think in a way, having that North Star, having that kind of priority of like, okay, of these like portfolio elements, these 2 or 3 are the key ones at the moment, and then really letting people know about it. I think that's the key, because we always assume we have to connect the dots ourselves, but actually most of the time other people connect them for us. especially when it comes to jobs. And then people might be like, oh, you've been really good at this, your vision is this, your purpose is this could really fit into this, or whatever it is. And so I think there's a lot in this idea of having clarity about this. And again, I would probably, it's almost like if you would like do a half pager about like what would be your, I mean, not necessarily TED story or TED talk, but like what would be your kind of, this is what I stand for, this is kind of the core pillars, the core principles, and this is how the project fit into this, and now this is the core project, and then feeding the hooks related to that project. And I think, being honest, like I don't think there's a golden bullet in terms of, I think it's a lot around experimentation. So for example, in whichever context I'm in, I'm always reframing a lot around how I do my introduction. Like, do I do it a bit more about the academic stuff? Do I do it more about the book? Do I do it more about serendipity, more about purpose? And so in a way, playing a little bit, also seeing what resonates with people, what really leads to this. I feel it's this journey of experimentation that comes from us having a first kind of idea of like a potential storyline, and then essentially rubber stamping this and seeing how it flies and what works, what doesn't. But most importantly, I think like having that prioritization, I feel is absolute core, because otherwise serendipity does distract potentially.
Mm. So we have to get this question in. So this person says, thanks for the talk, very interesting. What is your #1 tip for creating good luck?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, as someone who you know, loves you know, having 5 or 10 things on my mind, it's a great one. My absolute favorite is definitely how to use every conversation for serendipity to be injected. So to have every conversation when someone speaks, I'm always thinking about, how does this relate to what I'm working on, what my friends are working on? And so I'm constantly thinking about connecting dots. I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm resonating with it. But at the same time, I'm also trying to say, oh, great, this is how I could put you in touch with this person. This is how I could do this. And so this allows them to have a lot of serendipity happen, because, you know, you start identifying overlaps everywhere and get away from kind of box mindset type approaches. So I think I've also seen that with my students, like once we got them into introducing themselves and then building on what another person said and building on it in a way of, oh, this is how it relates to my thing, we get used to saying, oh, I thought a software engineer would be so different from a political scientist. But you know what? Coincidentally, we both just went through a transition that was all about how we can find our identity. And so we find these common denominators, but we don't find them if we don't constantly think about, okay, how do we ask more open questions, but also how do we constantly try to understand what is behind the things you're telling me and how can I do something with it? And so one of my favorites in that regard is really, apart from kind of trying to always think about how to connect things with each other, is also this idea of asking why a lot and in a non-intrusive way. So to understand what is the real intention, the real motivation, the real interest, because obviously, you know, a lot of times we might say something, but there's much more behind it. You know, if you go to a doctor and you say, I have a headache, yeah, that's what you can articulate at this point, because that's what the symptom that shows. But the doctor will always ask you what's behind that. Like, oh, maybe, you know, you might have cancer and the headache is just a symptom of that cancer, and whatever it is. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know if that's the symptom of it. But the point being that a lot of times trying to understand what is the real intention behind it and asking why quite a bit is actually a really effective way that companies like Toyota, for example, the founder of Toyota, he had this 5 why strategy where he would always, for every problem that would come up, he would always ask why 5 times to really get to the root cause of it, the root problem, rather than staying with the symptom. And I think I found that super effective, doing that in a very non-intrusive way, to really dive deeper into what is the real problem here. Is infidelity, when a friend tells me about cheating, is that really about the problem that someone was just attracted by someone, or is it because there was a real fundamental flaw in the relationship and that has to be worked on, or whatever it is? And so I think there's a lot in that once we try to understand what's behind what someone tells us and how could that connect to different things.
So since we're running low on time, I'm going to pick on this question because it's a little bit different. This is from an LSE alumna in Beirut. How would you link serendipity to a whole nation affected by an event simultaneously? I was reading your book after the explosion in Beirut on August 4th, and it really widened my perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great question. And I'm really sorry about this situation. I mean, it's obviously been shocking for all of us seeing that happening. And it's really something, one of the things that on a kind of systemic level, I'm excited about when talking about this content and trying to embed it, is really to say, ideally, we're setting up our systems and processes on the policy level, on the company level, on the organizational level in ways that are ready for these unexpected happenings to happen, so that we know that these things, I think this incident in itself is obviously extremely unique. And then at the same time, you know, a lot of our research, for example, with large companies shows that the most important decisions these leaders made were, if you take a Turkcell in Turkey, it was when a hurricane or a tornado happened, or for Best Buy, when there was a hurricane in Puerto Rico. Like, these are the moments of crisis where the system has to be really good at saying, yes, we didn't plan that, but we're set up for this because we know that the unexpected happens all the time. And I think this is something that when I work like with policymakers and with people like in education, other parts, it's really about saying we have to instill into our systems that kind of not only anti-fragility, so not only the idea that we have to be resilient enough to do something with it, but also we have to be ready to know that these things will happen and that we are essentially having people who can do something with it. And so I think I'd love to talk about this in more detail also in relation to Lebanon and other parts, because I feel very strongly about this idea that a lot of our systems are not set up that way. We tell ourselves we can set them up in a very clear, controlled way, but even the most controlled systems, like the unexpected, usually shapes them a lot. And as Connson said, COVID shifted everything in every country around the world. And these things, like they are always unexpected, but to some people they are not. And so how do we get better at understanding this and doing something about it? So there's huge application in that case as well. I'm always looking at it as like kind of, how do you see something as a dynamic thing rather than just the static thing that's out there?
So Christian, we only have 2 more minutes, but I really want to get this question in. So can you answer this in 1 minute?
I can't make promises, but I'll try.
There's an argument made that the rise in extreme inequality has to do with the tyranny of merit, that one deserves one's success, that success is due to one's own doing. How do you frame the serendipity mindset with this idea of the dark side of meritocracy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it reminds me a lot on this idea that you can never blame someone for bad luck, right? You can never blame someone either way you start out, right? If you start out with an extremely low serendipity base level because you grew up in Kibera or because something happened, you know, I think every one of us had experiences in our lives where we lost dear ones, where we had situations that are just bad luck, they're there, and that happens. And then on the side of, you know, if the serendipity mindset is all about saying, I myself can do something to essentially create that myself and for others, that is a lot about saying we can work hard to make that happen. And at the same time, I think it allows us to ask a lot of questions around what we understand as meritocracy so far, right? Is it just about hard work that is about achieving XYZ metrics, or are there, and that's what I love about serendipity and serendipity mindset in general, are we humanizing everything where we say at the end of the day, this is about potentiality of humans. This is about saying someone in a company who's connecting dots all the time for others should be remunerated for this. It shouldn't just be the guy or the girl who's going out and sells a lot of stuff. It should be the person who actually creates purpose and meaning through serendipity for a lot of other people. And so I think meritocracy in a way, to me, mostly is a problem if we have the wrong success factors and then like have people rise the ranks based on kind of the wrong success factors or not rise the ranks and everything else, versus once we rethink that and say, at the end of the day, if we have a more fluid system that allows to essentially integrate the idea that a lot of times the people behind the scenes are the ones who actually, and I think Connson, by the way, just also to mention that Connson has a wonderful book come out next year around a lot of themes that we talked about. And I think, Connson, one of the things we've obviously been talking about is how do you develop organizations that are inclusive enough that actually it's not only about those elements that usually white old people were good at, right? And then they got incentivized to do it, and then it's a reinforcing thing, to saying, no, what are the real criteria and the real metrics that we should use, but also at the same time saying we have to take into account that the world is not simple and that we cannot know a lot of times where exactly we're going. And if we pretend through the way we measure things, through the way we approach success and so on, that we can, it's just untruthful. And so I think just to wrap this point up, to me, that is at the core of it, to really say, at the end of the day, we need to get rid of this idea that we can understand exactly everything and really be more inclusive in that regard as well.
And I also think, I mean, to come back to Christian's own biography or his own life, is that if we use our serendipity to create opportunity for others, if we are lucky enough to be lucky, then let's focus on creating social impact and more equality and more, that's what we can do with our serendipity.
Yeah, and that's maybe as a very last thought, and I know, Connson, you want to wrap up. I see that the clock's ticking, but that's exactly also, I think, why I'm so delighted to be here with Stefan, with Amelia and the Marshall Center and Connson, you, because I feel like it's exactly about developing these opportunity spaces where you're saying it's not only about having a couple of people who know what success can be because they've been trained in being successful in traditional structures, to saying, no, how do we rethink structures in a way that make it more porous and more fluid in ways that we can build these kind of broader structures. And so I think that's also something where we would love to work with a lot of you. If you have ideas around how to do that effectively and at scale, I think that's the key thing always to say, how do we have structural change happen at scale that questions some of these institutional structures around how we measure success, around how we think about success, who should go up, who should go down. And to me, the serendipity mindset is at the core of it, because again, if we don't incentivize people, if we don't remunerate people for being that way that we just talked about, we will not have it happen as much because we're shutting that down. And so I think there's a lot of potentiality in that.
Great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for all of your questions. I'm really sorry, as usual, we haven't had time to get to all of them, but I wanted to thank Christian for his wonderful book, and thank you all for coming and engaging with this. We really appreciate it, and buy the book.